This is Matthew section 4, which I titled as Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. And again, that's pretty much from the end of chapter 12 through about the middle of chapter 16. That will be in that basic theme. And we're moving through the last half of that section 4, which I call stories about disciples and doubters, because that's basically what it is. It's more of a story section, and you encounter people on one end of the extreme or the other. Now, tonight, the passage is a well-known but poorly understood miracle of Jesus. Specifically, it's the walking on the water incident, and well-known definitely, but I think very often not grasped in every way that it should be. So we'll go ahead and read that passage, Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33. And this is just after the feeding of the 5,000. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now this miracle, again, one of Jesus's most well-known miracles. I mean, certainly walking on the water, something people associate with Christ. And yet I think most people, even Christians, don't really grasp the full significance of the miracle, maybe don't linger on its details long enough to really get it. In all cases, when Jesus does a miracle, these are signs. They are visible sermons, so to speak. They're meant to teach something. They're very much meant to show something about Christ or about God, and that is very much the way we ought to consider this miracle, and that's what I'm largely trying to do tonight. And when I was titling this message, I decided on The Divine Messiah Designs a Miracle, which I think summarizes everything I'm really trying to say tonight, because in this event, Jesus designs a miracle to show the disciples his divine sonship. So he's very much making a concerted effort to make this miracle happen, and it is very much to show something of who he is, that he is the divine Son of God. And I really want to break that down further into 3 points, which are the big points of my outline. So first of all, that the details of this miracle show the divinity of Jesus. So they're going to be an argument for the fact that he himself is God in the flesh. And then secondly, that Jesus has designed this miracle to be a revelation to his disciples. And I just want to show the effort Jesus put into making all this happen and the effect it had on those who followed him. And then finally, that the title Son of God refers both to his nature and to his kingship. I think very often we tend to slant the title Son of God in one direction, and I want to create a little more balance with how we understand the saying that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, to the stubborn opponents of Jesus that we're going to especially meet in this part of Matthew, Jesus is nothing but a peddler of parables. He just kind of goes around telling these weird stories. And to the crowds, Jesus is probably maybe a little bit better. He's more like a quick solution to health problems and food shortages, like we saw in the last story, where he feeds that crowd and heals all their sick. So a little bit better, but still not quite to where Jesus is really in reality. Now today's story is going to focus on just a few men in a boat who were loyal followers of Jesus. So they're not the opposition, and they're not even the crowds that are sort of enthusiastic about the new miracle worker that's in town. They are actually devoted disciples of Jesus. And today we're going to see what Jesus is willing to show those kinds of people. When he gets them kind of alone in a very, what really is a controlled situation, when he gets them by themselves, what he actually is willing to show them about himself. And that's really where we're going tonight with this whole story. So point one, that the details of this miracle show the divinity of Jesus. That when you start to analyze it, it shows his godhood. Now I want to reinforce this idea again that miracles, and the miracles of Jesus included, are signs. And when I say signs, it means they point to something. It's very easy to think that God randomly does miracles according to some whim. Maybe he has some sort of game wheel up in heaven that he spins every now and then. He's like, what am I going to do now? What miracle shall I show people? It's very easy to think that way because a lot of times these miracles do come out of nowhere. I mean, no one but perhaps Jesus himself expected walking on the water. So they do seem kind of random at first, but that is not really the case. That's not how God works. When God does a miracle, it is a sign. Like any sort of sign, like the signs we have on these windows or the road signs you see, they are meant to indicate something. They point to something. And miracles as signs are meant to show something about God. And when Jesus does his miracles, they are also signs, and they are signs about him. They're meant to show something about himself. So walking on the water in this miracle is a sign. We're supposed to learn something from it. As I said before, it is a visible sermon. Now, having established that idea, you still have to ask the question, what does this sign mean? What kind of meaning do we get from this? Well, as I have indicated, when Jesus walks on water in this case, he is giving a picture of his divinity. He is painting a portrait of himself as God in the flesh. And of course, this is an idea that we should all be familiar with, that Jesus has the same nature as God, that he shares the same nature as his Father. So we have God the Father, and we have God the Son, and then we throw in God the Holy Spirit because he's in there too, and this gives us the doctrine of the Trinity. So we have one God, three persons, equal but distinct, and all these kinds of things that we're very used to saying. Now, we got that idea, of course, from the Bible, but we acquired it in several different ways. In the case of Jesus, many of the things that he says and does just simply do not make sense unless he himself is more than just a man, more than just some powerful creature, more than even the second most powerful, most glorious creature in the world. They only really make sense if he himself is God. The things he does and the things he says create the strong impression that he is equal to his Father. And in particular, some of his miracles seem to be signs of his divinity in that same way. They seem to indicate his divinity in that way. And I consider walking on the water to be one of those signs. And that's the direction I'm taking this miracle as we talk about it. So you could say that the deity is in the details of this miracle. As we go through it, we see more and more things as we give it careful attention, things that indicate what Jesus is trying to say about himself, that he himself is divine. People have read this story for years and still do not always see these details. So I really want to come in here and just point them out to you and really make them evident as you read the passage. Specifically, there are 5 details that I want to note. All of them do in some way indicate that Christ himself is God. And they all work the same way, in fact. The same basic argument is used for all of them. And that is when you compare the actions of Jesus to the actions of God in the Old Testament, Jesus acts like God. So we're going to be flipping back and forth between the Old Testament and here, and just seeing how God acts, how Jesus acts, and you're going to see a lot of parallels there. So really the whole miracle is kind of like a theater in which Jesus plays the role of God. He has assumed that role in kind of this presentation that he's doing, trying to indicate this to the disciples. And it's a very bold move, especially the miraculous nature of it. As I was doing this message, I remembered an incident in my Old Testament survey class back in college. We were reading part of the book of Job, which is very much like a dialogue with different people speaking. And we took members of the class, gave them certain roles to read. And at one point the teacher said, okay, who wants to be God? And no one volunteered for that. No one wanted to read the role of God in the book of Job because no one wants to step into that role because it just seems blasphemous to do that. Well, Jesus steps into the role, doesn't bat an eye, and plays it very well because he himself is God in the flesh. And that is basically what the details here are going to show us. So let's start moving through these. Detail 1. Jesus sees across a great distance in dark, stormy weather, which you may not realize at first, but it is very much there. If you think about it, what happens is Jesus walks directly to where the disciples are. It's not like he's wandering around the lake not knowing where they are. He just goes straight to them. So he can see where they are. It's as though he knew exactly where they were the whole time, which may not sound so impressive, but you got to remember the facts of the story. What's going on here? First of all, there's a storm, right? There is a storm going on this lake, and it's blowing the disciples around. How well do you see in a storm? You know, whenever the storm starts going, does your visibility go down? Well, yeah, of course, it comes down to like right here, depending on how bad the storm is. So Jesus can see through that, apparently no problem. Secondly, it is nighttime. It's dark out there. Matthew says in verse 25 that they're in the fourth watch of the night, which we're not accustomed to using, but that's basically between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So still a lot of darkness out there. So in a storm at night, how well do you see in a storm at night? Probably not very well. So that's a factor. And then the boat is actually really far away. And the ESV says it says, what does it say here? That they're a long way from the land in verse 24. Really literally, and I can see why they may not have wanted to bring this out, they say that they are many stadia, which stadia is a increment of distance we don't use. A stadion is 600 feet. So many stadia, you're getting to the point where you're thousands of feet away. So thousands of feet away from where Jesus is, in a storm, in the dark, he can see exactly where they are well enough to walk straight to them without any trouble. And I think a lot of people, they just kind of say, well, Jesus was up on a high mountain praying. That's why he was able to see them. It's like, well, that only helps so much. You know, being high up, that can help you see further, but it still has to be clear air and light and somewhat close. I mean, it just doesn't explain it quite so well. All of these factors indicate that Jesus can see what no mortal can see. Now, you may not often think about this in terms of the attributes of God that we often rehearse, but God in the Old Testament can see in the dark. He can see very well in the dark, in fact, and I'm sure that's no surprise to you, but I do want to read a passage that brings that up particularly. Psalm 139, verses 11 through 12. The psalmist is talking about all these places where he cannot escape from God, or really where God will be with him even if he goes there. And he says, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me shall be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, the night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. So even in the dark, God can see perfectly. And wherever this guy goes, God's going to know where he is, he's going to see him, he's going to be able to take care of him. And guess what? Jesus is the same way. Even though the disciples are kind of lost in the middle of the sea here, in the middle of a storm, in the dark, he can see them, he can take care of them, just like God does in the Old Testament. So there's one detail in which you see Jesus with God's abilities, specifically this ability to see his people and take care of them, even in darkness, even when no one else would be able to. So there's detail 1. Second detail, sort of stating the obvious, that Jesus walks on the sea. He actually is able to tread upon the waves. Now, if I were to go out here, well, probably not now because there's no one out there, but if I were to go walking around the street and ask right now, who can walk on water? Just go around, do a survey. What person do you know of who is reputed to have walked on the water? Pretty much everyone is going to say Jesus. I mean, because that's what they associate with Christ. You know, he say, well, Jesus, he walked on the water. Who walks on water? Jesus does. Well, here's the catch about that. If you were to go back in time to the ancient Jews, you know, around this time, and ask them who can walk on water, they're going to say God. You know, of course, Jesus hasn't done it yet, so they can't say him, but in their mind, there is only one being that can actually walk on water, and they're going to say God. And again, you see this in an Old Testament passage. This is from the book of Job, chapter 9. This kind of gives a string of statements about God. It's the last one that interests me, but I want to read the whole thing just to give you the context. So Job 9 verse 1 is where we'll start. It says, then Job answered and said, truly I know that it is so, but how can a man be in the right before God? If one wished to contend with him, one could not answer him once in 1,000 times. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who has hardened himself against him and succeeded? He who removes mountains and they know it not, when he overturns them in his anger. Who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble. Who commands the sun and it does not rise. Who seals up the stars. Who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. There you go. It says that God tramples the waves of the sea. So there's God out there on the sea just trampling it down, and he's not sinking in it. He doesn't have to swim through it. He's just out there on it. Just, well, so God can do anything in that long list there, including trample down the waves of the sea. So Jesus, here, imagine the image now, in your being the good synagogue Jew that you are, things you know about God. One of these images you have from your days in the synagogue is God trampling on the waves of the sea. And now here in the middle of the storm, here comes Jesus just plodding around right through it, right there toward you. I mean, he looks like God. The image of God you have in your mind, Jesus is playing that out right before your eyes. So there's that second detail. Jesus walking on the sea, random as it seems, is meant to be a God-like image based on the Old Testament. Third detail, Jesus refers to himself with a divine title. He actually takes one of the names of God and applies it to himself. Now this is a case where something gets lost in translation, which does not really happen all that often in Bible translation, but happens enough to where you want to be sensitive to it. And here, what concerns us is this phrase Jesus uses when he speaks to the disciples. He says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And it's the phrase, "it is I," that is a little bit interesting here. It is I. Now, the Greek phrase that is there, that is translated "it is I," is ego eimi, which is a phrase that can just as easily be translated "I am." And it depends on context, really, what you want to make it say. I'm not really faulting the ESV translation here. "It is I" does make sense in context, but ego eimi, I am, that phrase. Now, the phrase "I am" sounds familiar. It's because that actually is one of God's titles. This, of course, is from the scene where he's talking to Moses at the burning bush, and Moses asks God, "Who shall I say is sending me? Who is the God that I am speaking for?" And he says here, Exodus 3, verse 13, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent you to." I am has sent me to you. Sorry, I got the last part wrong. But the important phrase is I am. Now, when they translated that into Greek, they used the phrase ego eimi, I am, because it's very naturally translated that way. So here you are reading this, and again, the first readers, reading it in Greek very much, and they're going to hear that and say, that sounds familiar to me. And what's familiar about it is that it's a divine title, that in the middle of this very godlike event, Jesus uses and applies to himself. So yeah, it's kind of hidden by our English translations, but it's a loaded phrase. And it's a phrase that's worthy of some attention because it's a divine title that Jesus applies to himself. Fourth detail, Jesus delivers people from deadly waters, which is probably not what you think of when you think of God, but in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms, one of the recurring images of God is that he saves people from waters. That's, again, one of the images you have of God in your mind. Not only does he trample down the sea, but he rescues people from the waters. That's what God does. And I just want to show you this. There are 3 passages I can read on this. Just go rapid fire here. Psalm 18, verse 16 is the first one. It says, "He sent from on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters." Go on, next one, Psalm 69, same kind of thing, verse 13 through 15. "But as for me, my prayer is to you, O Lord, at an acceptable time, O God. In the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me in your saving faithfulness. Deliver me from sinking in the mire. Let me be delivered from my enemies and from the deep waters. Let not the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me." So one of his prayers here is, God, save me from the deep waters. That's just the way you talk about God. He saves you from deep waters. Again, another psalm, Psalm 144. Verse 7, stretch out your hand from on high, rescue me and deliver me from the many waters, from the hand of foreigners. So the real problem is the foreigners that are coming after you, but the way he words that is save me from the deep waters, save me from the many waters. So again, this idea of God, he's the one who saves you from deep, dangerous waters. And I guarantee you, as the disciples were out there on that lake, being tossed around by those waves and by the wind, they were crying out to God to save them, because that's what God does. God saves people from the many waters. But who comes to answer their prayer? It's not God, it's Jesus. Because Jesus is God. He's the one very much filling that role for them and playing it very well. It was Jesus who answered their prayers in a way that only God does, according to the Old Testament. So there's another one, that God saves people from many waters. Jesus does it as well. One more detail, and that is that Jesus calms a stormy sea. The last part of the miracle here, we think of Jesus walking on the water, but at the end of it, as soon as he gets into the boat, the storm is done. And of course, not the first time Jesus has calmed a storm, but it is one of the times. Now, no prophet ever calmed a stormy sea, right? In the Old Testament, there's no man of God, even an empowered man of God, full of the Holy Spirit, that ever calms a stormy sea. Only God ever does that. And again, one of these images of God from the Psalms, just to say another psalm here, Psalm 89, verses 8 through 9. O Lord God of hosts, who is as mighty as you are, O Lord, with your faithfulness all around you. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. So again, one of the images of God from the Old Testament is he's the one that calms the sea. And when Jesus calms that sea, when he gets into that boat with the disciples around him, he's making a point. And the point he is making is, I am God. I do the things that God does. And he's been doing that for this whole miracle. So the details of this miracle, all 5 of them, show you the divinity of Jesus. They show you that he truly is God the Son. He is the divine Son of God. It's not just some random stroll across a lake just because he can do it. It's not just him flexing his divine muscles. It shows something. It's a visible sermon. It shows that Jesus is more than just a wandering storyteller. He is in fact God in the flesh, something that everyone else was missing, but which the disciples now see. And that brings me to the second point of this message that I said I would get to about the disciples, that Jesus has designed this miracle to be a revelation to the disciples. Now, we don't often think of miracles as being designed, maybe performed, maybe some need arises and God meets that need miraculously, but designing a miracle, sitting down, thinking about it, how do I make this happen, making the things take place to make it happen. Designing a miracle. I chose that word for a reason. I want that to be your buzzword for this point. We seem to have this idea that any true miracle of God is truly random, as I said, that just out of nowhere it comes. But that's not really how it is. This miracle was crafted for a purpose. And I want to sit here and I want to elaborate on that purpose for you in this point. Now, I say that Jesus designed this miracle based on the strange decisions that he makes toward the beginning of this story. Jesus starts doing things that are not very characteristic of him, and I think they need an explanation. Let's read verses 22 through 23 again, and you'll see what I mean. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. So at the beginning of this passage, Jesus does 3 things that are very strange, that are not commonly seen done by Jesus. The first strange thing is he dismisses the crowd. He sends them away. You actually never see Jesus do that elsewhere. Jesus is the one where when the crowds want him, they can come to him. In the feeding of the 5,000, he goes out there to this desolate place to be alone. This crowd comes out there to meet him, and what does he do? He doesn't dismiss them. He welcomes them. He heals them. He feeds them. Jesus invites the crowds. But here, go away. He dismisses the crowd. He sends them off. You never see Jesus do that elsewhere. Now he's like, what is he, standing on a rock saying, everyone get out of here. You're done. Vamos, or whatever that expression is. He just sends the crowd away, which is very strange for him. The second thing that he does that's very strange is that Jesus made the disciples leave as well. I mean, he sends them off on the boat. And the ESV says that he made the disciples get into the boat. I kind of prefer what the NASB margin says. He compelled them. He compelled them to get into the boat. He forced them to get into the boat. You know, they say, I don't want it. He kind of gives them a shove and says, get in the boat, sail across the lake. I'll see you later. I mean, you never see, you might expect Jesus to send the crowds away, but sending the disciples away. He chose them to be with him. That was the idea in the selecting of the 12. He chose them to be with him. That's the phrase used. And then now he's sending them away. He dismisses the disciples. Very odd. The third strange thing that Jesus does is that he stays behind alone, which of course there's no one left now. He sent the crowds away. He sent the disciples away. He's there alone, but he very much made that happen. You know, it's one thing to do, as Jesus often does, you know, sneaking away in the early morning to go pray by himself. We see Jesus do that from time to time. But here, he made sure there was no one around in the immediate vicinity, and then he goes up and prays. I mean, he sends everyone away so that now he is alone. And he even has, in a sense, no way to reunite with people because the boat's gone. He sent the disciples away on the boat. How is he going to cross the lake? I mean, you wonder if the disciples were asking, how's he going to cross the lake and meet up with us if we have the boat? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, he's alone out there. He has cut himself off entirely. No crowds, no disciples, no way to get to the crowds or the disciples again. I mean, everything Jesus has done here at the beginning of the story is bizarre. It's not his usual mode of doing things. Now, when a person begins to act strangely, one of two things is happening. Just as a general rule dealing with people. One possibility is that this person has lost his mind. If he starts doing things that are just off the wall and you can't make any sense of them, you might think he's gone bananas. I mean, he's gone, he's maybe had too much to handle, and now he's lost his mind. But the other possibility is that he has some plan which he has not fully revealed to everyone else. And everything he does makes sense in his plan, he just hasn't told you what the plan is. That is the other option. Now, given the circumstances of our story, and given that we're talking about Jesus, it seems that Jesus has something special planned, that he has designed something that he hasn't really revealed to anyone yet, but that's what's going on here, and that's why he's making these strange decisions and everything. So on the basis of those strange details, I think Jesus has designed this entire event for some purpose, that he has a plan, he actually wants to do something, and to make that thing happen, he's got to get the circumstances right. And that's why he's sending the crowds away, sending the disciples away, no boat, he's by himself. That's why he's doing those things. There's some purpose here. Now, what is that purpose? Well, the purpose of this miracle is to reveal more to his disciples, to actually give them a revelation of himself. In the very least, that's the result of all this. So if we want to judge Jesus' purpose by the actual result of his actions, you know, assuming that Jesus can actually make things happen that he wants, that's pretty much what his purpose is. The result of this is a greater revelation to the disciples, and so I presume that is Jesus' actual purpose. He did all of this for the purpose of showing the disciples these things that we've been talking about. Somehow, I think when Peter calls Jesus Lord in the middle of the story, it has a little more meaning than when Jesus was standing on solid ground. But how did they get to that point, right? I mean, Jesus had to contrive this whole circumstance. He had to get them off by themselves in the middle of the sea, in the middle of a storm, so that Jesus can come walking on the water and doing all of those things. He's got to get to that point. And again, same idea. They call him the Son of God later on. Well, how did they get to that point? I mean, the disciples have never actually called him that. In Matthew's gospel, the disciples have never referred to Jesus as the Son of God. And now they're saying, truly you are the Son of God. Well, where did they get that idea? They saw Jesus doing these things. He created this circumstance, and then in the middle of that circumstance, he does this thing that shows them who he is. And then, after all that, the disciples go all the way and they worship Jesus. They actually treat him as though he were God himself. At the very end, those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. There's worship there. Well, why are they worshiping Jesus? Well, because he created these circumstances, and in the middle of those circumstances, he's able to do this miracle that shows them that he is God worthy of worship, and therefore they worship him. Seems like they all got the idea. And of course, the disciples haven't worshiped Jesus by this point either. So it's a tough crowd. It's not an easy crowd to win over, but in this one incident that Jesus has designed, he actually did it. He showed them who he was, and they got the idea. And my assumption again is that Jesus intended all of this, that this was his plan. It's not that he's lost his mind. It's not that he's had a bad day and he wants everyone to get away from him. He actually created the circumstances of this miracle so that it could happen, so that he could make this revelation of his divinity to his disciples. And at the end, they worship him. So that was the purpose of this miracle, to reveal more to the disciples. And as I've been saying, it worked. We have here in this miracle a really good example of the disciples believing the signs of Jesus. As I've said, the fourth section of Matthew, in this fourth section, the opposition to Jesus becomes more and more stubborn while the disciples believe the signs. And as his signs pile up, they believe in him more and more. Well, in this sign, you see that happen. This particular sign has finally taken the disciples to the point of saying, "You are the Son of God," and worshiping him. It has finally taken them to that point. You know, Jesus said earlier in this section, "To him who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance." That's one of his rules for dealing with people. And the disciples, they had a little knowledge of Jesus. They've been following him around for a while. They don't necessarily understand a lot, but they have held fast to his teachings, and they've been faithful. They've been faithful with what little knowledge they have had. And so Jesus gives them much more knowledge, so that they now have an abundance. And that abundant knowledge is this divine revelation of Christ, this showing of himself to be God in the flesh. To him who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. Okay? But what's the other side of that equation? For him who has not, even what he seems to have will be taken away. So those people that are not dedicating themselves to Christ's teaching, they lose. Well, in this case, the people of Nazareth, they didn't see this miracle. I mean, if Jesus had done this miracle for the people of Nazareth who rejected him, would it have changed their minds? We'll never know, because Jesus didn't do it for them. They didn't accept Jesus, so now they lose out on this. Same way with Herod. Same way with the Pharisees and the scribes. Same way with all of these people who are in opposition to Christ. You know, they saw Jesus on occasion, they heard him teach, didn't think much of it, didn't follow him, and so what happens to them? They lose. Even what they seem to have is gone. And that's the way Jesus deals with these people. Meanwhile, the disciples continue to believe, and they continue to believe all the more, seeing the signs that Jesus does only for the faithful. To him who has, more is given. That's what you see with the disciples. And they have an abundance. I mean, this probably blew their minds, right? I mean, they have more, they have seen Christ do more than they ever thought they would see him do at this point. They have an abundance at this point. And this is the perfect moment to discuss Matthew's most unique detail in his telling of this story, which is Peter walking on the water. You see, Peter, people forget about Peter. You ask who walks on the water, you say Jesus. Well, there was one other guy in the history of the world who walked on the water, and that was Peter. You see that here at the very end of the story, or the middle rather. Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, what is kind of frustrating, probably especially if you're Peter, frustrating for you if you are Peter, that people wrongly assume very often that Peter should have never left the boat. That he's like, "Oh, Peter, he's at it again," that impetuous Peter doing what he shouldn't. And that's generally the way people read this story, like Peter should have stayed in the boat. Well, those people forget three things, three very important details in this story. First of all, Jesus told Peter to come onto the water, right? Peter asked permission. He said, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come out on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." I mean, was Jesus wrong to give those instructions? I don't think so. Secondly, Peter actually did walk on the water. It's not as though he tried and failed utterly. He, at least for a small portion of that time, was actually walking on the water. Do you honestly think that God was not with him in that moment? I mean, if God's not pleased with his action, why is he enabling Peter to walk on the water with his son? I mean, that's like an exclusive club there. I mean, you don't just jump on the water and start walking around with the Son of God. It seems like God was with Peter in that. So there's a problem. And then thirdly, when Jesus rebukes Peter, he does not say, "Why did you leave the boat?" He doesn't say, "Oh, Peter, why did you leave the boat?" He says, "No, why did you doubt? You of little faith, why did you doubt?" That was the rebuke. It wasn't leaving the boat, it was his doubt. The problem with Peter is not that he walked on the water. The problem with Peter is that he looked at the water, right? Because when he started seeing the wind and the waves and all that, that's when he started to sink. The problem was not that he walked on the water. The problem was that he stopped looking at Jesus and started looking at the wrong thing. He should have kept looking at Christ. And if that had happened, Peter would have probably walked out on the water and walked right back, no problem. And no one would ever say, "Oh, Peter, he should never have done that." That was the problem with Peter. Not that he tried to walk on the water, but that he had those doubts. So, all that to say, for a brief moment, Peter did indeed become one of only two men who ever walked on the water. He did that. Now, how did Peter do that? What was the mode of that miracle that he did? Well, very simply, he believed Jesus, right? He said, "Lord, if it's you, invite me to come out to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come out here." And Peter believed that, and he went out there. Peter believed what Jesus told him to do, and he acted on it, and that is why he was able to walk on the water, which is pretty extraordinary. If you remember when I taught on the feeding of the 5,000, I made the point that it could have been the disciples feeding the 5,000, because Jesus commands them, "You give them something to eat," expecting them to do the miracle. And of course they say, "Oh, we have nothing here but a few loaves and a few fish." And so Jesus does it. So they don't have so much faith at that point. But now, at this moment, when Peter sees Jesus doing this, it's like his faith comes alive and he says, "Lord, if that's you, you invite me to come out there with you and it'll happen." And Jesus says, "Come," and he does it. It was by faith that Peter did this, by faith in Christ. Peter here, rather than serving as a picture of what disciples should not do, Peter is a picture of what the disciples are becoming, of what these 12 men are slowly becoming as they follow Jesus. Yes, they are men of little faith. Okay, you have little faith, you have little faith. Yes, okay, it's there. But they're men of little faith. At least they have faith, which is a lot more than a lot of the people in Israel at this time. And that faith is growing. It's getting bigger and it's getting stronger. And their faith is becoming the kind of faith which starts to take risks. Peter, he was just a moment ago scared out of his mind because he's in this sea storm and he thinks he sees a ghost, but now he's like, "I want to walk on the water with Christ." I mean, his faith is starting to take risks. It's that kind of faith. And soon, that kind of faith is going to cause an uproar in whole cities and nations when these 12 men go out preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the kind of faith you see forming. It's half formed. It's little faith right now, but it's on the way to becoming big faith. And as Jesus reveals more of himself to the disciples, their faith becomes ever bolder and ever stronger. And that's the result of this miracle Jesus does and his other miracles. And that is why Jesus put such an effort into designing this miracle, to reveal more of himself to the disciples, to make their faith grow stronger. It's an incredible thing. It's a miracle. It's a great miracle designed for one purpose, to help these men understand him better and believe him more. That's why Jesus did it. Well, there's one more point I want to deal with tonight before we call it quits, and that is that the title Son of God refers both to his nature and to his kingship. And surprise, surprise, calling someone the Son of God has loads of implications, right? Not a small title, but it really goes in two directions, and I want to focus on those. And I want to dwell on this point here for a little longer for three reasons, really, and I just want to lay them out to you, because it seems kind of unrelated to everything else I'm doing, but it's important. I want to talk about it now. First of all, the chief point of this passage is, truly you are the Son of God. right? That's the conclusion the disciples come to. After all this, after all these details, after all this conniving Jesus does to make this miracle happen, the conclusion is, truly you are the Son of God. So, surely we can afford to spend some time on this. It's the main point of the story. Truly you are the Son of God. What does that mean? You are the Son of God. So let's think about that. That's one reason to talk about this. The second reason for dwelling on this point is that I think the sonship of Jesus is not always well understood by Christians. I think that we believe it and we say it and we mean that, but I don't think we fully understand everything that goes into that title, which I can only speak from my own understanding, my own experience on that, but my experience is Christians don't always think about everything that goes into this title, Son of God. And then finally, my last reason for dwelling on this is that it is a fundamental part of our faith. It is a cardinal point of what makes Christianity, Christianity. The world is full of people who talk about Jesus in some way. You know, there's no shortage of people who name the name of Christ. Only a relative few of these people would call Jesus the Son of God, though. You know, would go all out and say he is the Son of God. And we even live in a time when loads of people would call themselves Christians, yet not call Jesus the Son of God. You know, they would sort of fall back to a lesser, more watered down version of Christianity in which he's not quite the Son of God, he's just some kind of great teacher or whatever. Well, you know, that's just kind of bland and everything. There are, among the people that are truly Christians, this idea that Jesus is the Son of God is a very weighty part of our confession of faith. To declare for all mankind that Jesus is the Son of God and make no apology and no qualification for that statement is one of the true signs of a genuine Christian faith. Even when Christians beat each other up for other beliefs they have and have these squabbles with one another, they can still agree on one thing, that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, what does that mean? What does this ultra-important statement mean? So let's talk about that. For many Christians, I think the title Son of God is primarily a description of Jesus' nature. When we talk about his essence, what is he? Well, he is the Son of God. Now, the son of a tiger is a tiger, right? Tigers beget tigers, basic biology. The son of a whale is a whale. Same idea. You know, whales beget whales. The son of a human is a human. So, Jesus is the Son of God. So, what is Jesus if he is the Son of God? Well, Jesus must be as much God as his Father is God. If his Father is God and he's his Son, then he must be God himself, right? That's how it works. That's how this whole idea of sonship works. That Jesus is the Son of God makes him God the Son. It makes him fully divine. It gives him a divine nature because he is the Son of God. Now, this is how most Christians primarily understand the title, a statement of nature. In fact, it probably even is the chief idea of Jesus walking on the water. So I don't really want to take anything away from that idea. I think it is the primary meaning here that we're supposed to get as we see Jesus do these things. I spent the first part of this message showing how Jesus portrays himself in this miracle as God. He steps into the role of God himself and he plays it very well. When Jesus walks on the water, he does what his divine nature enables and requires him to do. He does the things of God because he is God by nature. Why would he not do these things if he is in fact God the Son? There is this earlier incident in Matthew, I just want to bring this in here, where Jesus calms a storm, and we don't need to go there, but in that miracle, that story ends with the disciples asking a question. You know, they don't worship him, they don't say anything, all they do is they ask a question. And the ESV translates that question, what sort of man is this? You know, what kind of man is this? And really, if you want to give a very literal translation, what they say is, what is this? You know, there's this thing in our boat, what is it? You know, what is this Jesus guy? The disciples are asking about the nature of Jesus, right? You know, what sort of man is this? What is this thing in our boat? What is he? Well, in this later miracle, when they see Jesus do more than just calm a storm, they finally answer that question. They finally answer the question as to what the nature of Jesus is. And their answer is, truly you are the Son of God. That's the that's the answer to the question that they were asking. So this miracle really is, I think, a revelation of Jesus as the Son of God by nature. Now, there is another aspect of this title, Son of God, and this one doesn't get as much attention as I think it should, and it refers to the kingship of Jesus. That is, to the idea that he is the Messiah. So the Jews were awaiting their Messiah, the anointed one. You anoint kings with oil as part of their inauguration ceremony. The Messiah is the anointed one. And the Messiah was to be a king descended from King David, who would rule this endless kingdom established by God himself. That was the whole idea. Now the Messiah, long before Jesus came along, was known as the Son of God. I think we very often equate Messiah with Son of God because we know Jesus fills both roles. But before Jesus was even around, people were referring to the Messiah as the Son of God, before we even knew that the Messiah would be the Son of God by nature. It starts really with the covenant made with David. Let's read that passage. 1 Chronicles 17, verses 11 through 14. This is when God is actually making that covenant with David, which eventually leads to the Messiah. 1 Chronicles 17, verse 11. When your days are fulfilled to walk with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be to him a father. Catch that? I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. I will not take my steadfast love from him as I took it from who was before you, but I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. So what you see here is that God officially adopts the descendants of David. Your son is going to be my son. Sort of a divine adoption taking place there. That starts with the very beginning of the covenant with David. And you go a little further, sometimes in Scripture, the Messiah, as the son of David, is sometimes called the Son of God, right? Psalm 2 is probably the most noteworthy place where this is done. Go ahead and read this whole thing here just because the image of sonship is very prominent throughout it, and it's very much the Messiah. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, the Messiah, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So there you see king. So you have the Messiah, the anointed one, who is this king. Now who is this king? I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth as your possession. And you shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So the Messiah is this king who is the Son of God. The Messiah is known long before Jesus ever came as the Son of God. It was a messianic title. And this idea was not lost on later Jews. Before they even had the idea that the Messiah was going to be a divine person equal with God, they were calling the Messiah the Son of God. And I want to read you a passage here. This is from a Jewish book called 2nd Esdras, which was written about the time that Jesus was around, actually. So it definitely shows you ideas about the Messiah that are contemporaneous with Christ himself. So 2nd Esdras 7 verses, I know you can't turn there, I only have the book. Any Catholic Bibles out there? Is this the Apocrypha? Yes, it is. Okay, 2nd Esdras 7 verses 27 through 28. This is God speaking in this vision that the author is relating here. Everyone who has been delivered from the evils that I have foretold shall see my wonders. For my Son, the Messiah, shall be revealed with those who are with him, and those who remain shall rejoice. So God speaking refers to the Messiah as my son. So there you go. I mean, later Jews did not lose this idea that the Messiah could be called the Son of God. Even though they didn't really have the idea of a divine person being the Messiah was still known as the Son of God. Because at the very beginning of the Davidic covenant, God adopted the descendants of David as his own. That was the way the covenant worked. Now, to get into Matthew's gospel again, there are times in his gospel where the title Son of God seems to equate to the Messiah, or the Christ, as he usually uses. The Christ is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew Messiah. Let's just read two of these passages. One, a very important passage, Peter's great confession, Matthew 16:16. Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So we go straight from Messiah to Son of God. You see the equation there. And then later on, even among people who are not disciples of Christ, still speak this way. Matthew 26, verse 63, at the trial of Jesus, definitely a hostile crowd. Verse 63, but Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." So even the unbelieving high priest has this idea that the Messiah, the Christ, is the Son of God. And he certainly doesn't believe in a divine person filling the roles of the Messiah. That'd be polytheism, right? In the Jewish standpoint, right? But he very much equates Christ with Son of God. So given that close link, I think the disciples themselves had their understanding of this phrase deepened during this incident on the water. They had already been coming along with this idea that Jesus is the Messiah. They're probably following him in hopes that he is the Messiah. Peter will soon make his famous confession that he is indeed the Christ, is indeed the Messiah. And so in that line of thinking, they might think of him as the Son of God, because the Messiah, as the descendant of David, is sort of adopted by God, and that's how he's the Son of God. Well, then in this incident, Jesus comes doing things that God himself alone does, and now it's like, whoa, the Son of God as king actually is the Son of God by nature. So I think they have their understanding deepened here. I think as we read the passage in Matthew's gospel, you have to have both ideas in there. I think it is primarily a revelation of his divine nature, but when Matthew says Son of God, I think you have to take all the messianic implications that the Jews had for centuries before this time, and which Jews even at that day had as they thought about the Messiah as the Son of God. So it is a loaded phrase. This title, Son of God, very much is full of implication, and therefore is all the more important for our confession of faith. When we say that Jesus is the Son of God, we mean two things. As Son of God, Jesus answers all of the ancient desires for an unshakable kingdom of righteousness. But he does that as a divine person who is therefore unshakable himself. The reason this king, who is called the Son of God, can rule this everlasting kingdom is because he himself is God and he is everlasting. He cannot be overthrown. Therefore, his kingdom is forever. The term Son of God cuts both ways. I just wanted to ensure that everyone knows that and remembers that as they call Jesus the Son of God, because it is full of meaning. So I just here want to summarize at the very end, make a few more points, and then we'll be finished. First of all, the divine Messiah designs a miracle, right? That was my title for this, and the details of the miracle do show the divinity of Jesus. These miracles of Jesus, they routinely show something. They are signs. They are meant to teach. And when Jesus walks on the water, he is giving a sign of his divinity. He is teaching that he is God in the flesh. And I detailed 5 aspects of the story in which Jesus acts out the role of God as portrayed in the Old Testament, showing that he himself is fully divine. And Jesus, secondly, has designed this miracle to be that revelation to his disciples. He intended it for that purpose. I say that he designed the miracle based on the strange decisions that he was making toward the beginning of the story. Sending everyone away and being alone and all that, very strange, but it does create the idea of some secret purpose that he has. And that purpose is to reveal more to his disciples in this miracle. And in this miracle and through this miracle, we see the disciples believing the signs of Jesus more and more and having their faith in Christ strengthened by it. And that is especially shown in the incident with Peter, who shows his own faith growing to the point where he is now willing to take risks because he believes in Christ. And then finally, I made my point that the Son of God title refers both to Christ's nature and also to his kingship. The title refers to Jesus as God's Son by nature, equal to his Father in what he is, by his very essence. But also the title is for the Messiah, the King, showing God's favor and promise to King David to provide a great kingdom for Israel that will never be shaken. So this passage, when you really start to break it down, truly has great glory. It is a wonderful passage. It's a great manifestation of who Christ is and what he does. But in one way, this passage is also a warning. And I haven't really come around to this point yet, so I want to say it here before I close. This passage really is a warning. In my last message, I mentioned that Jesus performed his greatest miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, for a crowd of people who were willing to follow him into a desert, right? The crowds, fickle as they are, they were willing to follow Jesus out there into a desolate place, even though it meant possibly going without food until Jesus miraculously provides food. That's what they did. Well, in today's miracle, walking on water, the audience is even more restricted. It's not a crowd of 5,000 plus people. It's just 12 men in a boat. And these men are the most loyal men in Christ's retinue. These are the ones that follow him wherever he goes. They follow him so loyally, he has to compel them to leave him when he makes them go into the boat and cross the lake. To those faithful few, Jesus gave a far greater revelation of himself than he ever gave to most people. I mean, the feeding of the 5,000 was great, and it shows a lot. I even called it the greatest miracle of Jesus, but the walking on the water miracle shows even more of who Jesus is as the Son of God. And he gave that miracle just to the smallest group of his most devoted followers. And we need to remember that such things are only done for people who are already committed disciples. Those who do not follow Jesus get nothing. Even what they do have is taken away from them, as we see with other people in Matthew's gospel. I mean, Jesus doesn't do these things for everyone. Those who follow Jesus get to see Jesus in action. Those who have faith, they see their faith rewarded. They're the ones that get to go out and walk on the water, however faltering it might be. They're the only ones who get that. Jesus is not a dog performing tricks for skeptics. When the skeptics come to him asking for signs, he says no. But to his disciples, he does wonders. He does such signs that they have to fall down and worship him. I mean, these Jews who have been told there is only one God, worship him alone, are now worshiping this one man as God, because he is God. I mean, what more proof do you need? But Jesus only gave that kind of sign to someone who already had faith. Jesus is the Lord of heaven and earth, and he only reveals himself to those who love truth. And you have to be in that crowd. Everyone else, they get left in the dark. I find it a very powerful warning to remember that we need to maintain our faith, that we need to be the faithful. You want to see God do great things, you want to see him answer prayer, you want to see him, bend the laws of nature even, you have to already believe in him. You can't call God down and say, do this and then I'll believe in you. It doesn't work that way. You have to trust him at his word, because his word is good enough. And if that's your attitude, then God will do wonders among you. But only then. Everyone else loses what they had. So I think the passage is a powerful warning, even as it gives this great manifestation of who Jesus is. This is the kind of God with whom we have to do. He's a God that can demand faith because he's worthy of faith. He doesn't have to do the tricks to get your attention. Those are just to help you when you find yourself caught in a storm. Okay, well, that is all that I had to say. Are there any questions on this